In May of 2025, 11 divers pulled the first objects ever recovered from a ship that has been lying on her side for 109 years. The ship is the Britannic. She is the third and largest of the Olympic-class liners, bigger than the Titanic by nearly 2,000 tons. She has been sitting in 120 meters of water in the Aegean Sea since 1916. And until this year, nobody had ever brought a single thing back from her. Most people know the Titanic. Most people know it hit an iceberg, that it broke apart, that it is sitting in pieces at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Fewer people know the Titanic had two sister ships. The Olympic sailed for 24 years and was scrapped for parts. The Britannic lasted 11 months. She was supposed to be the safest of the three. She sank the fastest. What I could not get past was this. The Titanic has been picked apart for decades. Expeditions, lawsuits, artifacts in museums, a feature film that earned $2 billion. The Britannic is in shallower water, in warmer seas, in better condition. She is more intact right now than the Titanic was the day after it sank. And for over 100 years, not one person removed a single object from that wreck. I checked this against the source data because the math sounded made up. One man bought the rights to this ship from the British government. He paid £15,000. That is less than a used car. And that purchase is one of the reasons the Britannic sat untouched for nearly 3 decades after. To understand why they finally went down there, you need to understand what they found. And to understand what they found, you need to understand what has been lying on the seabed off the Greek island of Aegean since the morning of November the 21st, 1916. The 2025 recovery was organized by Simon Mills, a British historian and camera technician who founded the Britannic Foundation. Mills has owned the wreck since 1996. The operation was supervised by Greece's Authority of Underwater Antiquities, the government body that controls access to every significant wreck in Greek territorial waters. The dive team consisted of 11 professional deep-sea divers using closed-circuit rebreather equipment, the kind of gear that recycles your breathing gas instead of venting bubbles, because at 120 meters you cannot afford to waste a single breath. The conditions were difficult: strong currents, poor visibility, a wreck lying on her starboard side at nearly 85 degrees, which means anything inside the ship is oriented almost sideways. Reaching a corridor means swimming through what used to be a wall. A staircase becomes a horizontal tunnel. The geometry of the wreck is wrong in every direction. They brought up the ship's observation post bell, a portside signal lamp, a pair of binoculars, ceramic tiles that once decorated a Turkish bath, equipment from first and second class cabins, and a porcelain wash basin from one of the second-class cabins, still intact after more than a century underwater, encrusted with marine organisms but whole. The artifacts were lifted using airbags, secured in specially designed containers, cleaned at a field station on the island of Aegean, and then transported to laboratories in Athens for conservation. Some objects identified in the original recovery plan could not be brought up. Their condition was too fragile. Their position within the wreck was too dangerous to access safely. This is a ship that has been lying in salt water for 109 years. What survives is what the sea allowed to survive, and what the sea allowed the divers to reach. The artifacts are headed for the National Museum of Underwater Antiquities, currently under construction in the port city of Piraeus. They will sit in a dedicated World War I section, the Britannic, as a centerpiece exhibit. The first physical evidence of this ship to see daylight since 1916. Here is something most people do not know. The Britannic never carried a single paying passenger. She was never a cruise ship. She was never a luxury liner. She was built to be one. Harland and Wolff laid her keel in Belfast in November of 1911, 8 months before the Titanic sank. By the time she was launched in February 1914, Europe was weeks away from war. By the time she was finished in December 1915, she was no longer a passenger vessel. The British Admiralty requisitioned her, painted her hull white with green stripes and red crosses, and sent her to the Mediterranean as His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. She made 5 round trips between Southampton and Mudros, the Allied base on the Greek island of Lemnos, ferrying wounded soldiers from the Dardanelles campaign back to Britain. On her 6th voyage, she sank. She spent more time being built than she spent at sea. And for 109 years after that, nobody touched her. The 2025 expedition was not just the first recovery. It was the first time anyone had been permitted to remove anything at all. The wreck itself has cost one life already. In 2009, Carl Spencer, a British diver and expedition leader who had organized multiple surveys of the Britannic, died during a dive to the wreck. Spencer had been instrumental in documenting the ship's condition. His National Geographic broadcast expedition located mine anchors near the wreck site, which confirmed how the Britannic was lost. He was the first and so far only person to die exploring this ship. The wreck had already taken a life before anyone brought a single object to the surface. The wreck tells you what happened before you read a single page of the inquiry. She lies on her starboard side at approximately 85 degrees of inclination, 3 nautical miles northwest of the main port of Kea. The 3 propellers are still in place. The rudder is turned to port. That rudder position is evidence. It means the captain was turning the ship when she went down. He was trying to steer her toward Kea, roughly 3 miles to the right. He was trying to beach her. He did not make it. The damage is concentrated at the starboard bow, between holds 2 and 3. This is where the mine struck. The explosion warped the steel and jammed the watertight doors in the open position. In the first 10 minutes after the blast, the flooding put the Britannic in roughly the same condition the Titanic had reached 1 hour after hitting the iceberg. Same shipyard, same class, same basic hull design, only with improvements. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Britannic took 55. Surveys of the wreck confirmed what the original 1916 inquiry suspected, but could not prove from the surface. The portholes on E deck and F deck had been left open. On a hospital ship operating in the warm Mediterranean, open portholes were standard. You need fresh air circulating through the wards when you are carrying 3,000 wounded men in a steel hull. In peacetime, an open porthole is ventilation. In a sinking, open portholes are holes below the waterline. As the Britannic listed to starboard, every open porthole on the lower decks became a water intake. The flooding outpaced the bulkheads. The redesigned watertight compartments that Harland and Wolff had built specifically in response to the Titanic disaster were rendered useless by fresh air. The irony of that is worth sitting with. Harland and Wolff redesigned this ship from the inside out after the Titanic went down. Stronger bulkheads, a double hull along the lower sections, giant gantry davits that could reach across the full width of the deck to launch lifeboats on the high side during a list. They tripled the number of lifeboats. 58 boats on a ship that was supposed to be the answer to everything the Titanic got wrong. They called her the safest ship afloat. That phrase aged badly. She sank faster than the ship she was built to improve upon. And the thing that killed her was not the mine. It was the open windows. The mine came from U-73, a German mine-laying submarine. Her commander was Kapitän Leutnant Gustav C.S. In October 1916, U-73 laid a field of mines in the Key Channel, a choke point between the Greek mainland and the islands that every Allied ship heading to the eastern Mediterranean had to pass through. The mines did not distinguish between warships and hospital ships. One of them found the Britannic a month later. For decades, a competing theory held that the Britannic was torpedoed, not mined. A torpedo attack on a hospital ship would have been a war crime under the Hague Convention. A mine is indiscriminate. The distinction mattered legally and politically. When Carl Spencer's Sonar team located the mine anchors near the wreck site and cross-referenced them with U-73's war diary, the debate effectively ended. It was a mine. The Britannic was not targeted. She was unlucky. But the mine did not kill 30 people. What happened next did. Halfway in, subscribe so the next ship comes to you instead of the other way around. HMHS Britannic, built by Harland and Wolff, Belfast. Yard number 433. Laid down November the 30th, 1911. Launched February the 26th, 1914. Completed December the 12th, 1915. In service December the 23rd, 1915. Out of service November the 21st, 1916. 11 months, 48,158 gross register tons, 882 feet 9 inches long, 94 feet across the beam, a displacement of 53,200 long tons fully loaded, 9 passenger decks, 3 propellers, capacity for over 3,000 wounded in hospital configuration. She was the largest vessel in the world to be sunk during the First World War. She departed Southampton on November the 12th, 1916, on her 6th voyage to Mudros. 1,066 people were aboard, 673 crew, 315 members of the Royal Army Medical Corps, 77 nurses. She was heading out to collect wounded, which means that on this voyage, the hospital wards were empty. She was carrying nothing but medical staff, empty beds, and supplies. She stopped at Naples on the 17th for coal and water. A storm kept her in port until Sunday afternoon. Captain Charles Bartlett, her commanding officer, decided to take advantage of a brief break in the weather and ordered the ship out. The seas rose again as she left port, but by the next morning, the weather cleared and she passed through the Strait of Messina without incident. Cape Matapan, the southernmost point of mainland Greece, was rounded during the early hours of Tuesday the 21st. By morning, she was steaming at full speed, around 21 knots, into the Key Channel. At approximately 8:12 in the morning, an explosion tore through the starboard side of the Borough, between holds 2 and 3. The blast was powerful enough to snap the antenna cables between the masts, cutting off wireless communication for critical minutes. No one was killed by the initial explosion. The area of the blast was unoccupied at the time, but the damage was catastrophic. Within 2 minutes, boiler rooms 5 and 6 had to be evacuated. Within 10 minutes, the ship was in the condition the Titanic had not reached for an hour after the iceberg. On the bridge, Captain Bartlett had to make a decision with almost no good options. The ship was flooding fast. Key was visible to starboard, roughly 3 miles away. If he could beach her on the island shore, he could save the ship and everyone aboard. He ordered full speed ahead and turned the rudder to port, aiming for Kea. That decision was the right call for the ship. It was the wrong call for 30 people. As the Britannic pushed forward, crew members on the boat deck began preparing lifeboats. Some boats were swung out and lowered toward the water, but the propellers were still turning. The ship was still moving. On the port side, 2 lifeboats were lowered into the sea before the captain gave the order to abandon ship. Whether by panic or by initiative, the crews of those 2 boats put themselves into the water while the Britannic was still under power. The boats drifted aft. The suction caught them. They were drawn into the port side propeller. The propeller destroyed both boats and nearly everyone in them. Violet Jessup was in one of those lifeboats. Jessup was a nurse with the British Red Cross, 29 years old, from Argentina by way of Ireland. She had worked aboard the Olympic when it collided with the warship HMS Hawke in 1911. She had worked aboard the Titanic when it struck the iceberg in 1912. On the Titanic, she was put into lifeboat 16 and handed a baby by one of the officers. She held the baby through the night until the Carpathia picked them up the next morning, when a woman grabbed the child from her arms without a word and disappeared. Now, on the morning of November the 21st, 1916, Jessup was aboard the 3rd Olympic-class ship to meet disaster. She had just come from morning mass. She was sitting down to breakfast when the mine detonated. She made it to a lifeboat. The lifeboat drifted toward the propellers. She saw what was coming. She jumped. She was sucked under the keel. The hull struck her head. She surfaced alive and was pulled from the water. She did not know it at the time, but the impact had fractured her skull. She only found out years later, when a doctor investigating her chronic headaches discovered the old break. Jessup would become known as Miss Unsinkable. She continued working aboard ships until 1950. She retired to a thatched cottage in Suffolk and died in 1971 at the age of 83. She survived all 3. Captain Bartlett did not know about the lifeboat massacre until it was reported to him on the bridge. He ordered the engines stopped immediately. The propellers halted just in time. A 3rd lifeboat was seconds from being drawn in. Captain T. Fernhead and the RAMC personnel in that 3rd boat physically pushed against the now static propeller blades and floated clear. At 8:35, 23 minutes after the explosion, Bartlett ordered abandon ship. Over the following half hour, the remaining crew and medical staff boarded 35 lifeboats or went into the water. At 9 o'clock, water reached the bridge. Assistant Commander Dyke informed Bartlett that everyone was off. Dyke, Chief Engineer Fleming, and Bartlett simply walked off the ship and into the sea near the forward gantry davits. At 9:07, the Britannic rolled over and slipped beneath the Aegean, 55 minutes from mine to gone. The fastest sinking of any Olympic-class liner, faster than the ship she was built to replace. 30 dead. 1,036 survived. HMS, Scourge, HMS, Heroic, and local fishing boats from Kia conducted the rescue. Nearly every death was caused not by the mine, not by the flooding, not by the sea. Nearly every person who died on the Britannic was killed by the ship's own propellers. Right now, as of the most recent survey, she is still lying on her starboard side in 120 meters of water, 3 nautical miles off the coast of Kia. The question the title of this video asks is why? Why did nobody touch this wreck for over 100 years? The Titanic sits at 3,800 meters in the freezing North Atlantic in international waters, and has been the subject of more than 30 major expeditions, a congressional act, at least 2 multinational lawsuits, and a $2 billion film. The Britannic sits at 120 meters in the warm, clear Aegean. She is in better condition, she's more accessible, she is larger. Why was she left alone? The answer is not one reason. It is a chain of decisions, each one reasonable on its own, and each one adding another year of silence. The British government held title to the wreck through the legacy ownership of White Star Line assets. They did not visit it. They did not survey it. They did not fund an expedition. In August of 1996, a man named Simon Mills bought the wreck from the British government for £15,000. Mills was a camera technician in the UK film industry who had backed into Britannic research through an accidental involvement in a Titanic documentary in the late 80s. By the time the documentary was finished, he had become the foremost authority on the Britannic almost by default. When someone asked why he bought the wreck, he said he could not give a definitive answer. He just did. Mills's ownership gives him legal rights over entry to the wreck and the retrieval of artifacts. But the wreck lies in Greek territorial waters. Any dive, any survey, any recovery operation must be permitted and supervised by the Greek Ministry of Culture through the Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities. So, the wreck has 2 gatekeepers, a British private citizen and a Greek government agency. Both must agree before anything happens. For decades, both said no or simply said nothing. There is no cover-up here. The decision is what it looks like. The Britannic is treated as a heritage site and a de facto war grave. She was a hospital ship. 30 people died aboard. The red crosses painted on her hull were not decoration. They were a legal classification under the Hague Convention. The moral weight of that classification, combined with Greek heritage law and British private ownership, created a bureaucratic barrier that no one had sufficient reason to break through. The paperwork moved slower than the corrosion. The French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau found the wreck in 1975. Robert Ballard surveyed it in 1995 using the U.S. Navy's NR-1 submarine. Carl Spencer led multiple documentation expeditions. Scientists from the Hellenic Center of Maritime Research studied the organisms growing on the hull in 2008. But nobody removed anything. Not a bolt, not a tile, not a cup. For 109 years, the only things that left the Britannic were photographs and sonar readings. So, why 2025? The answer is the same shape as the answer to why not before? Decisions. Simon Mills organized the expedition. Greece's Ephorate approved it. A new museum in Piraeus needed a centerpiece. The Britannic Foundation coordinated the logistics. The political alignment, the institutional will, and the practical funding all converged in the same year for the first time. The chain of decisions that had kept the Britannic untouched for over a century finally moved in one direction. The marine biologists who studied the wreck in 2008 found something worth noting. The layer of organisms growing on the Britannic's hull, the barnacles, the corals, the iron-eating bacteria, has become so thick that it has formed a structure of its own. They concluded that this biological layer will likely persist as a visible trace of the ship's shape even after the steel beneath it has corroded completely. The Britannic will disappear one day. The metal will go. But the outline of her will remain, drawn in living things, long after the ship itself is gone. The 30 people who died on the Britannic are harder to name than the Titanic dead. Most appear in the records as RAMC personnel and general crew. The passenger lists that made the Titanic a household name do not exist for the Britannic because there were no passengers. There were only staff heading out to collect the wounded, but the records are not empty. George Honeycutt was a crew member aboard the Britannic. He was in one of the 2 lifeboats that were drawn into the propellers. He was not in the water because of the mine. He was in the water because someone lowered his lifeboat before the captain gave the order, while the engines were still running, while the propellers were still turning. The mine put a hole in the ship. The decision to keep the engines running pulled the lifeboats toward the stern. The decision to lower those boats early put 30 people in the path of the blades. Honeycutt is still in the Aegean. In May of 2025, a pair of binoculars came up from 120 meters of water. They had been down there since November of 1916. Somebody aboard the Britannic used those binoculars to watch the sea. They might have been on the observation deck. They might have been the pair that spotted the island of Kea on the horizon that Tuesday morning. They spent 109 years in salt water, in the dark, on a ship lying on her side. They are in a laboratory in Athens now, being cleaned for a museum that has not been built yet. If you think a hospital ship on her side for 109 years is strange, wait until you see what is sitting upright on the floor of the Norwegian Sea, leaking radiation since 1989. That video is next. If a ship comes to mind, leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you found this worth the time.